Caroline Augustin. We have reason to believe she's employed at this school.
I don't care what reason you have. You're not approaching any of my teachers without a judicial warrant and proper clearance.
We're federal agents. We don't need your permission.
Actually, you do. This is a school. We have student privacy laws, employee protections, and protocols.
The school hallway was filled with students changing classes when two men wearing vests with the letters IACE in large letters entered through the main gate without prior warning. They didn't ring the bell, didn't announce themselves to reception, didn't ask permission to enter educational property where children were present. They simply walked in as if they had every right in the world to invade a space that should be a sanctuary for learning and safety. What these agents didn't expect was that the staff of this school wouldn't simply hand over one of their own without a fight. Caroline Augustin was a 32-year-old math teacher who had worked at that school for 6 years, loved by her students and respected by her colleagues. She had emigrated from Haiti as a teenager, built a life in the United States, obtained her college degrees while working full-time, and finally achieved her dream of becoming an educator. That October morning, she was reviewing algebraic equations with her 9th grade class when the principal appeared at her classroom door with an expression she had never seen before, fear mixed with fierce determination. Before we continue, leave in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button because stories like this need to be told and you won't want to miss what happens when a school community decides it won't let federal agents trample constitutional rights. What happened at that school became one of the most important cases about Fourth Amendment protections in educational institutions. The two ICE agents were specifically looking for Caroline, with an administrative warrant, not a judicial warrant signed by a judge, but a piece of paper issued internally by the agency itself that didn't carry the same legal weight. They demanded the school hand over Caroline immediately, treating the principal and staff as if they were inconvenient obstacles rather than professionals responsible for the safety of hundreds of children. The principal, a man named Thomas Rivera, who had run that school for 15 years, made a decision in that moment that would define not just the rest of that day, but the next 3 years of legal battles. Thomas told the agents they had no permission to be there without a proper judicial warrant, that a school was a sensitive area under ICE's own policies that supposedly discouraged enforcement in educational locations, and that he would not allow them to frighten his students or violate his staff's rights. The agent's response was immediate and revealing about how they viewed their authority. One of them, a tall man with sunglasses he refused to remove even inside the building, said they didn't need permission, that they were doing their job, and that anyone who interfered could be arrested for obstruction. But Thomas wasn't alone in his stance. Within minutes, other staff members began appearing in the hallway where the agent stood, forming a human barrier that blocked access to the corridors where classrooms were located. Teachers, teaching assistants, the school counselor, even custodial staff, all positioned themselves together in silent but firm refusal to allow the agents to advance further. The school's security cameras captured everything, every moment of this extraordinary display of solidarity, every word exchanged, every attempt by the agents to intimidate people who refused to be intimidated. Students who witnessed the confrontation in the hallway immediately understood what was happening. Some grabbed their cell phones and started recording, creating multiple independent video records that would later become crucial evidence in court proceedings. Others ran to tell their teachers, spreading word from room to room that ICE agents were in the building trying to take Ms. Augustin. The news spread through the school faster than any intercom announcement could, and the students' reaction would be one of the most powerful parts of this entire story. Caroline was in her classroom, still not fully knowing what was happening outside, when her own students began positioning themselves in front of her door. 14 and 15-year-old teenagers who moments before had been complaining about math problems were now literally putting their bodies between their teacher and federal agents. They didn't understand all the legal details, didn't know about warrants or the Fourth Amendment or immigration status. But they understood perfectly that someone who cared about them, someone who had taught and encouraged and believed in them, was in danger and needed protection. The standoff in the hallway lasted nearly 40 minutes, a tense impasse where neither the agents nor the school staff were willing to back down. The agents kept insisting they had legal authority to be there and take Caroline, while Thomas kept demanding to see a proper judicial warrant and explaining that, without one, they were violating not just the agency's own policies, but also fundamental constitutional rights. The agents' frustration grew more obvious with each passing minute, their body language becoming more aggressive, their voices rising in volume, clearly not accustomed to having their authority questioned so directly and publicly. That's when Thomas made the call that would change everything. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed not the local police, but an immigration rights attorney with whom the school had previously established a relationship, specifically for situations like this. Within minutes, the attorney was on the phone, speaking directly with the ICE agents, explaining in precise legal terms why their presence at the school without a judicial warrant constituted illegal entry, why their administrative warrant was insufficient, and why if they tried to forcibly remove Carline, they would be opening both themselves and their agency to substantial legal liability. The attorney's voice on the phone completely changed the dynamic of the confrontation. The ICE agents, who moments before had been demanding access with absolute arrogance, suddenly became defensive and evasive when confronted with someone who knew the law as well as they should have known it. The attorney, Michael Chen, specialized in immigration rights for over 20 years, systematically dismantled every argument the agents tried to make. He cited specific Supreme Court cases, ICE's own regulations about sensitive areas, and made absolutely clear that if they didn't leave voluntarily, the school would pursue all available legal actions against them personally and against the agency. Students who were recording captured the exact moment the agents realized they had lost. Their postures changed, their shoulders dropped slightly, and the aggression in their voices was replaced by something resembling uncertainty. The taller agent, the one who had been most vocal about his authority, finally removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked less confident now that he was being legally challenged by someone he couldn't simply intimidate. He muttered something about coming back with appropriate documentation and made a move to leave, but Thomas wasn't ready to simply let them go without consequences. Thomas, still with Michael on speakerphone so everyone could hear, demanded the agents' full names and identification numbers, information they were legally required to provide, but clearly didn't want to give. After embarrassing hesitation captured on multiple student videos, they finally provided their IDs, which Thomas immediately wrote down, along with the exact time of their unauthorized entry and the fact that they had threatened to arrest staff members who were simply protecting everyone's rights. The school staff remained forming their human barrier until the agents were completely out of the building and off school property. Once the agents left, the entire building exploded with activity. Teachers rushed to check on Carline, who was in her classroom surrounded by her students who refused to leave her alone even after the immediate threat had passed. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what almost happened finally hit her. Her students, these teenagers who often complained about homework and seemed disinterested in learning, were around her offering hugs, words of encouragement, and promises that they would never let anyone take her. The bond between teacher and students, always strong, had been cemented in that moment of crisis into something unbreakable. Thomas called an emergency staff meeting immediately after ensuring all students were safe and accounted for. He explained that what had just happened was much more serious than just agents showing up at school. It was a violation of Carlene's rights, a violation of the sanctuary schools should represent, and potentially a violation of the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure. Michael Chen, the attorney, joined the meeting via video call and confirmed that Carline had extremely strong grounds for a civil lawsuit against ICE for multiple violations, and that the school could join that lawsuit for damages caused by the agent's disruptive behavior. News of the confrontation spread beyond the school walls with impressive speed. Parents began calling after their children, texted them about what they had witnessed. Instead of the anger Thomas feared, that some parents might be angry the school had protected an illegal immigrant, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Parents expressed pride that school staff had protected one of their own, gratitude that administrators had prioritized rights and dignity over simply obeying authority figures, and concern for the well-being of both Carline and the students who had witnessed the traumatic event. Local media picked up the story that same evening when multiple student videos were shared on social media and went viral. The footage clearly showed school staff forming their protective barrier, showed agents trying to intimidate and threaten, and most powerfully, showed students literally shielding their teacher's door from adult men with badges and guns. The visual narrative was undeniable. This wasn't a story about immigration enforcement. It was a story about a community protecting one of its own members against what they correctly perceived as abuse of power. Immigration rights organizations across the country began reaching out, recognizing this case could set important precedents about where and how federal agents could conduct enforcement operations. The ACLU offered additional legal support. Student rights organizations highlighted how traumatic it was for children to witness armed agents trying to remove their teacher. Teacher unions point to the case as an example of why educators need to know their rights and their colleagues' rights when confronted with federal authority. Carline, meanwhile, had to make the hardest decision of her life. She could try to keep her head down, hope ICE didn't come back, and continue living in constant uncertainty. Or she could fight, use this moment when she had public attention and legal support to challenge not just what had happened to her, but the entire system that allowed it to happen. Michael Chen was honest with her about what fighting would mean. Years of legal battles, constant media attention, the risk that immigration authorities might retaliate by trying to deport her through other means. But when Carline looked at videos of her students placing themselves between her and the agents, when she read the hundreds of messages of support from parents and community members, when she thought about all the other people in similar situations who didn't have the witnesses or the luck or the support she had, her decision became clear. She would fight, not just for herself, but for all. The other teachers, workers, community members who lived in fear that agents could show up anytime, anywhere, and rip them from their lives without proper due process. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks after the incident, a meticulously constructed 47-page legal document that not only detailed what had happened that October morning, but exposed a systematic pattern of ACE violations in communities across the country. Michael Chen had assembled a team of 5 attorneys specialized in constitutional rights, immigration rights, and educational law to build a case that went far beyond just Carline. They argued that the agents' unauthorized entry into the school violated the Fourth Amendment, that their attempt to remove Carline without a proper judicial warrant constituted illegal arrest, and that their threats against school staff represented intimidation under color of authority. The federal government's initial response was exactly what Carline's attorneys expected: complete denial of any wrongdoing. Department of Justice lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that federal agents had broad authority to conduct enforcement operations wherever they believed undocumented individuals might be located. They claimed sovereign immunity, the legal principle that government cannot be sued without its consent, and suggested that Carline, as a person without legal status, had no standing to challenge immigration enforcement actions. It was the government's standard playbook: argue that the law simply didn't apply to them the same way it applied to everyone else. But the judge assigned to the case, Judge Sandra Mendoza, a federal appointee with a reputation for rigorously upholding constitutional rights regardless of who was in the defendant's seat, rejected the motion to dismiss almost immediately. In a 23-page initial ruling that made headlines in legal publications across the country, she wrote that constitutional rights belong to all people on American soil regardless of immigration status, that schools are indeed sensitive areas with special protections, and that the allegations presented by Carline were serious enough to merit full trial. The decision was a major early victory that signaled this case would be taken seriously by the judicial system. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed even more than Carline's legal team had hoped to find. Through subpoenas and document requests, they discovered that the 2 agents who had entered the school had histories of complaints about aggressive tactics and unauthorized entry onto private property. Internal emails showed that ICE supervisors were aware that the agency's policy discouraged operations at schools, but that this guidance was routinely ignored without consequences for agents who violated it. More damaging still, there was evidence that the operation targeting Carline had been based on an anonymous tip that was subsequently determined to be from a person with a history of making false reports motivated by xenophobia. Government attorneys tried to keep this information out of court, arguing it revealed confidential enforcement methods and could compromise future operations. Judge Mendoza rejected most of these objections, determining that the public had an interest in understanding how immigration enforcement decisions were made and whether federal agents were following their own rules. She ordered ICE to produce training guidelines, policy memos, and disciplinary records for the two agents involved, creating a public record that immigration rights organizations would use for years as evidence of systematic misconduct. The case began attracting national attention when civil rights advocacy organizations started filing amicus curiae briefs, legal documents from non-parties interested in offering their perspectives on the issues at stake. The American Civil Liberties Union argued that allowing federal agents to enter schools without judicial warrants would create a chilling effect where immigrant children would be afraid to attend school. The National Education Association spoke about how the intrusion had traumatized students and disrupted the learning environment. Even some local sheriffs from conservative jurisdictions filed briefs arguing that uncoordinated federal enforcement in their communities undermined police-community relations. While the legal case progressed, Carline's life was in a constant state of uncertainty and stress. She continued teaching because her students needed her, and because quitting would have felt like letting the agents who tried to take her win. But every day she arrived at school, wondering if today would be the day ICE came back, this time perhaps with a proper warrant, or simply waiting for her outside school property where protections were less clear. She stopped driving certain routes, avoided public places she used to frequent, and developed chronic insomnia that required medication just to get a few hours of fitful sleep. Her students, those same teenagers who had positioned themselves in front of her door, noticed the change in her. The teacher who used to laugh easily and make jokes while explaining complex math concepts now seemed tired, often lost in thought between classes. They began leaving notes on her desk, simple messages of support and love that she kept in a folder that grew thicker each week. Some students organized a fundraiser without her knowing, selling bracelets with the words, "Protect Ms. Augustine," to help with her legal expenses even though she had pro bono representation. The media continued following the story, especially after more details from legal discovery became public. Investigative reports exposed that ICE operations in sensitive areas had increased dramatically in previous years, despite official policies stating otherwise. Journalists found dozens of other cases where agents had entered schools, hospitals, churches, and courthouses without proper warrants, relying on the fact that most people didn't know their rights or were too frightened to challenge federal authority. Carline's case was becoming a symbol of a much larger issue about limits of federal power and protection of vulnerable community spaces. Thomas Rivera, the principal whose quick action had protected Carline, also faced consequences. Some parents in a vocal minority felt he had exceeded his authority and put other students at risk by confronting federal agents. There were calls for his dismissal from certain community members who believed schools should cooperate fully with law enforcement regardless of circumstances. The school district had to hold several heated community meetings where Thomas defended his actions, explaining that protecting constitutional rights wasn't political but fundamental, that children needed to see adults standing up for principles, even when it was difficult. The school district itself became a co-plaintiff in the lawsuit after its own attorneys reviewed the law and agreed that ICE agents had indeed violated both federal and district policies by entering without a judicial warrant. This was a courageous decision that some other districts in similar circumstances hadn't made, preferring to stay quiet and hope the controversy would pass. But the school board, influenced by massive turnout of parents and students at their meetings, demanding they support Carline and Thomas, voted unanimously to join the lawsuit and seek their own compensation for damages caused by the disruption. The trial was scheduled to begin 18 months after the initial incident, a period of time that felt simultaneously like it flew by and dragged on interminably for Carline. In that year and a half, her story had become a talking point in national debates about immigration, with politicians on both sides using her case to argue their points. Some painted her as a victim of an out-of-control enforcement system that didn't respect basic boundaries or human dignity. Others tried to frame her as someone who had broken the law by entering the country and was now trying to use the court system to avoid consequences. Neither of these narratives really captured the complex reality of who Carline was, a woman who had built a life, contributed to her community, and simply wanted the same constitutional protection that should belong to everyone. The week before the trial was set to begin, something unexpected happened that would dramatically change the trajectory of the entire case. ATO whistleblower from within, ICE, came forward with internal documents showing that the operation targeting Carline had not been based on legitimate intelligence or routine enforcement practices, but had been specifically directed after she appeared in a local newspaper article about successful immigrant teachers. The article, published 6 months before the agents showed up at her school, had highlighted Carlene's journey from Haiti to the United States and her dedicated work educating children in an underserved community. Someone had read that article, identified her workplace, and provided that information to IICIE specifically to punish her for having dared to be public about her story. Michael Chen immediately filed a motion to include this new evidence in the trial, arguing it proved the entire operation had been motivated not by legitimate enforcement concerns, but by targeted malice against someone who had become visible as a successful immigrant. Judge Mendoza agreed the documents were highly relevant and admitted them as evidence. Government attorneys objected vehemently, claiming that motivation for initiating an investigation was irrelevant as long as there was legal basis for the action taken. But the court rejected that argument. The judge made clear that when federal agents act on personal or discriminatory motivations, rather than legitimate enforcement purposes, it absolutely matters in evaluating whether rights were violated. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Carline's students, now older but still deeply invested in the outcome, filled 2 entire rows. Immigration rights organizations sent observers to document the proceedings. Journalists from local and national publications occupied every available seat in the press area. Public interest in the case had grown so intense that the judge had to issue special rules about courtroom decorum and warned that any disruptions would result in immediate removal. The tension in the air was palpable as the 2 legal teams made their opening statements, each painting a radically different picture of what had happened that October morning. The prosecution called Thomas Rivera as their first witness, and his testimony established the foundation for everything that would come after. He described in precise detail how the agents had entered without permission, how they had refused to show a proper judicial warrant, how their threats had created an atmosphere of fear among students and staff. Under cross-examination by the defense, he remained calm and consistent, refusing to be provoked into emotional statements that might undermine his credibility. When asked if he understood he was potentially obstructing federal agents in their duties, Thomas replied firmly that protecting constitutional rights wasn't obstruction, but obligation, and that he would do exactly the same thing again under identical circumstances. The students who had recorded the confrontation also testified, their young voices trembling slightly with nervousness, but their accounts remaining clear and detailed. They described seeing their favorite teacher surrounded and threatened, the instinctive decision to protect her even without fully understanding all the legal implications, and the lasting impact witnessing that event had on how they viewed authority and justice. One student, a 15-year-old girl named Maya Rodriguez, cried when describing how she used to love school but now had anxiety every morning, fearing something similar could happen again. Her testimony was so powerful that even some jury members appeared to be holding back tears. The video evidence from school security cameras and student cell phones was played for the jury, and the impact was devastating for the government's defense. The videos didn't lie and didn't exaggerate. They showed exactly what happened without filter or interpretation. Jurors watched the agents entering without announcement, saw their aggressive body language, heard their threats against staff members who were simply demanding proper documentation. They saw school staff forming their protective barrier, saw students literally shielding their teacher's door, and saw the agents eventually backing down when confronted with organized legal resistance. It was impossible to watch that footage and conclude the agents had acted appropriately or within the bounds of their authority. Carline testified on the 4th day of the trial, and her appearance on the witness stand was the moment everyone had been waiting for. She wore simple professional clothing and spoke in a calm but firm voice as she told her story, from her childhood in Haiti to her journey to the United States, her years working to pay for college, her realized dream of becoming a teacher. She described the terror of that morning when she learned agents were in the building looking for her, the incredible bravery of her colleagues and students who refused to let her be taken, and the months afterward living with constant fear of when ICE might return. When asked why she had decided to sue rather than simply quietly accept her situation, her answer was simple but profound. Because no one, regardless of immigration status, deserves to be treated as if constitutional rights don't apply to them. Cross-examination by government attorneys tried to paint her as someone who had deliberately avoided proper immigration processes and was now playing the victim when facing consequences. They asked about every detail of how she entered the country, implying that someone who had violated immigration law had no right to invoke constitutional protections. Michael Chen objected repeatedly that these questions were irrelevant to the issue of whether agents had violated her rights, and the judge sustained most of his objections. But even when forced to answer questions about her immigration status, Carline remained composed, acknowledging her status wasn't currently legal, but insisting that didn't give agents the right to invade a school without proper judicial warrant. The government's defense called the two ICE agents as witnesses, and their testimony was disastrous for their own side. Under direct examination, they tried to paint their entry into the school as standard procedure, claiming they had followed all appropriate protocols, and that the administrative warrant they possessed was adequate documentation. But under cross-examination by Michael Chen, their stories began to fall apart. When pressed on why they hadn't obtained a judicial warrant when they knew they would be entering a school, a sensitive environment under their own agency's guidelines, they had no good answers. When confronted with the whistleblower documents showing the operation had been based on a newspaper article rather than legitimate criminal intelligence, they became defensive and evasive. The most damaging moment came when Michael presented disciplinary. Records showing both agents had received multiple complaints for aggressive tactics in previous operations. The government's defense had argued these records should be excluded as irrelevant, but the judge determined they were admissible to establish a pattern of behavior. The jury learned that one of the agents had been briefly suspended years before for entering a home without a warrant, and that the other had been the subject of an internal investigation for excessive use of force during a different arrest. The defense tried to argue these previous incidents had been resolved and shouldn't reflect on the current case, but the damage to their credibility was done. Expert witnesses testified on both sides about whether the agents had followed proper procedures. The government's defense brought retired enforcement officers who argued that obtaining judicial warrants for every operation was impractical and that administrative warrants were legitimate tools. The prosecution brought constitutional law professors and Fourth Amendment experts who systematically explained why the distinction between administrative and judicial warrants mattered, why schools deserved special protections, and why the agents' actions had clearly crossed legal lines. The technical testimony was dense and sometimes confusing, but the core message was clear. What had happened at Carline's school was not within the bounds of the law. Closing statements happened on a rainy Friday that seemed appropriately dramatic for the culminating moment of a case that had consumed so many lives for so long. Michael Chen spoke first, his voice clear and passionate as he systematically reviewed every piece of evidence proving Carline's rights had been violated. He reminded the jury of the footage showing agents entering without permission, of testimony from traumatized students, of whistleblower documents revealing discriminatory motivations behind the entire operation. He framed the case not just as about one woman or one school, but about the fundamental principle that constitutional rights exist to protect everyone, especially the vulnerable, especially when authority tries to overstep its bounds. Government lawyers argued in their closing statement that this case was being used by immigration activists to undermine legitimate law enforcement, that the jury shouldn't allow sympathy for a charismatic teacher to obscure the fact, that she was in the country illegally and that agents had simply tried to do their jobs. They insisted administrative warrants were valid legal tools, that entry into the school had been justified, and that any trauma experienced by students was result of the school administration's decision to make the situation confrontational rather than simply cooperating. The argument fell embarrassingly flat after everything the jury had seen and heard during weeks of testimony. The jury deliberated for 3 days, an agonizing waiting period where Carline could barely eat or sleep, where Thomas mentally reviewed every decision he had made, wondering if he had done enough, where students who had testified obsessively checked their phones, waiting for news. Michael Chen had warned Carline that juries were unpredictable, that even with strong evidence there were no guarantees, that she should prepare emotionally for any outcome. But he also admitted that in his 20 years practicing law, he had Rarely seen a case with such clear evidence and such convincing witnesses. When word finally came that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled again with the same crowd that had attended the trial. Carline sat between Michael and the rest of her legal team, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles went white, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her students were behind her, some holding hands, others with eyes closed as if praying. Thomas was a few rows back, his expression calm but tense, ready to accept whatever consequences might come from his decision to protect his staff. The room was in absolute silence when the judge entered and asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. The jury had found unanimously in favor of Carline on all charges. They determined that ICE agents had violated her Fourth Amendment rights through unauthorized entry, that they had attempted illegal arrest without proper judicial warrant, and that their actions constituted intimidation under color of authority. They also found against the federal government for failure to properly train and supervise agents, for maintaining policies that allowed these violations to happen systematically, and for targeted retaliation against Carline for speaking publicly about her experience as an immigrant. The verdict included substantial compensatory damages for Carline and punitive damages intended to send a message that such conduct would not be tolerated. The courtroom exploded in reaction. Carline's students cried and embraced each other, their celebrations muted only by urgent reminders from the court bailiff to maintain decorum. Immigration rights organizations present in the room immediately began posting on social media about the historic victory. Journalists rushed outside to start writing headlines that circulated minutes later. Jury rules against ICE in school entry case. Teacher wins. Lawsuit over constitutional rights violation. Verdict. Sets precedent for sensitive area protections. Carline sat stunned for a moment, unable to process that it was really over, that she had won, that the judicial system had actually upheld her rights despite her immigration status. Judge Mendoza thanked the jury for their service and then addressed comments directly to the ICE agents who sat rigidly at the defense table. She said their behavior had been a betrayal of public trust, that federal agents had special responsibility to know and follow the law they had sworn to uphold, and that their actions had caused real harm to real children who deserved to feel safe in their schools. She noted that while the jury had determined the outcome of the civil case, she was referring questions of possible perjury and obstruction of justice to the U.S. Attorney's Office for consideration of criminal charges based on false testimony the agents had given during the trial. The monetary value of damages awarded to Carline was substantial enough to make headlines on its own, estimated by legal observers at several $1 million when compensatory and punitive components were combined. But, as she had made clear throughout the process, money had never been the point. She immediately announced plans to use a large portion of the settlement to establish a legal fund specifically focused on helping other teachers and educational workers facing immigration threats, ensuring that what had happened to her could at least create a pathway for others to receive the same legal defense she had been fortunate to find. The days and weeks following the verdict brought an avalanche of media attention that transformed Carline from anonymous victim into national public figure. She was invited to appear on national news programs, was contacted by authors wanting to write books about her case, received invitations to speak at universities and law conferences across the country. She accepted some of these invitations, but declined others, cautious about becoming defined only by her court case rather than her real work as an educator. When she spoke publicly, she always redirected focus to the larger systemic issues: immigration enforcement policies that separated families, the need for stronger protections for sensitive areas, the importance of communities uniting to protect vulnerable members. The verdict's impact reverberated through immigration enforcement systems across the country. ICE was forced to review and rewrite its policies on sensitive area operations, making guidelines more stringent and consequences for violating them more severe. Multiple other school districts that had been hesitant about how to respond when agents showed up now had clear legal precedent supporting their right to demand proper judicial warrants and refuse entry without them. Advocacy organizations began using Carline's case as an educational tool, creating training materials for schools, churches, hospitals, and other sensitive institutions about how to protect people under their care from unauthorized federal entry, The two agents who had entered the school faced their own consequences beyond the civil verdict. One was fired from ICE after an internal investigation concluded he had repeatedly violated agency policies and then lied about it under oath. The other was demoted and reassigned to desk work with no field enforcement capacity. Both faced criminal investigations for the perjury they committed during the trial, though eventually no charges were filed, due to procedural difficulties of proving false statements had been intentional rather than memory failures. Still, their careers in law enforcement were effectively over, their names permanently associated with a case that became synonymous with abuse of authority. Thomas Rivera received commendations from educational organizations across the country for his principled stand. The school district that initially faced pressure from some community members for supporting his actions now reaped praise for institutional courage. Thomas himself was promoted to a district-level position overseeing student safety policies and community relations, where he worked to ensure other principals had the training and support they needed to protect their staff and students in similar situations. He often spoke publicly about the case, always emphasizing he had done nothing heroic, just what any administrator should do when confronted with attempted violation of rights of people under their care. The school itself became a symbol of community resistance and solidarity. Parents who initially had been skeptical about getting involved in immigration issues now understood that protection of constitutional rights wasn't a partisan issue but a fundamental one, something that could affect anyone regardless of their background or status. The unity demonstrated during the crisis had strengthened community bonds in ways that extended far beyond the specific incident, with parents and teachers working more closely on multiple issues because they had seen what could be accomplished when people refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. Carline continued teaching at the same school, now with a different kind of recognition from her students. They had always respected her as a teacher, but now they understood on a deeper level what it meant to stand up for principles even when it was frightening, what it meant to fight through a complex legal system to vindicate rights that should never have been questioned. Her math classes continued focusing on equations and theorems, but the students who sat in those rooms now had a lived lesson in civics, courage, and the power of communities protecting their members that no textbook could have taught as effectively. 3 years after the verdict, Carlane's life had found a new equilibrium she never would have imagined possible that frightening October morning. Her immigration status had finally been resolved through a legal pathway her case had helped open, a special provision for victims of discriminatory law enforcement that allowed her to apply for permanent residency without having to leave the country first. The process took nearly 2 years of endless paperwork and interviews, but in the end, she held in her hands a green card that represented not just legal status, but validation that she belonged here, that her contributions mattered, that the America she had dreamed of existed even when it seemed to be slipping from her grasp. The legal fund she established with part of her settlement had grown beyond her most optimistic expectations. Donations from people around the country who had been touched by her story allowed the fund to help over 200 families in its first 3 years, providing legal representation for teachers, healthcare workers, and others in sensitive fields who faced deportation threats. Some of these people won their cases, others received relief through different avenues, and some eventually had to leave the country, but all of them had proper legal defense and the dignity of having their cases properly heard, instead of simply being ripped from their lives without due process. The school where it all happened had incorporated the lesson of that day into its fundamental identity. A small, discreet plaque near the main entrance commemorated the event, not with names or specific details, but with simple words. This school stands up for all its members. Constitutional rights are non-negotiable. Community means protection. New teachers during orientation heard the story of what had happened and received training about their rights and the resources available if they ever faced similar situations. Students learned about the case in government and social studies classes, using it as a real example of how constitutional principles work in practice. The students who had shielded Carline's door, now in high school and starting to think about college, carried that experience with them in ways that shaped their future aspirations. Several chose career paths in law, social justice, or education, specifically because of what they witnessed and the role they played. Maya Rodriguez, the girl who had cried on the witness stand, was now in her first year of college studying constitutional law, with dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. She kept in regular contact with Carleen, still calling her Ms. Augustin, even now that they were more like friends than teacher and student. Thomas Rivera had become a national voice in the conversation about how schools should navigate the tensions between federal authority and student protection. He wrote articles for educational publications, testified before congressional committees about proposed legislation, and trained school administrators in dozens of districts on protocols for dealing with immigration agents. His argument was always the same. Schools have a primary obligation to protect all students under their care, and that obligation doesn't disappear when a student or staff member happens to be an immigrant. He spoke about Carleen's case not with heroic pride, but with gratitude that he had done the right thing when it mattered. The legal precedent established by Carline's case had been cited in dozens of subsequent court decisions involving immigration enforcement issues in sensitive areas. Some cases expanded the protections even further, clarifying that not just schools, but hospitals, churches, shelters, and other community spaces deserved special considerations. Other courts pushed against the precedent's boundaries, trying to limit its scope, but the core principle remained. Federal agents couldn't simply ignore basic constitutional requirements because their targets happened to be non-citizens. The law was far from perfect or consistently applied, but Carline's case had moved the line in a way that protected vulnerable people from some of the most flagrant abuses. National immigration rights organizations kept Carline's case prominent in their educational materials and advocacy. They had created a complete curriculum called the Augustin Case that was used in law schools, teacher training programs, and community workshops to teach about the Fourth Amendment, due process, and the complex intersections of immigration law and constitutional rights. Videos of students protecting their teacher's door had become iconic, played at conferences and seminars as a powerful example of how ordinary people could make a difference when they refused to stand passive in the face of injustice. ICE as an agency had made changes in response to the case, though advocates argued the changes didn't go far enough. Administrative warrants were still used, but now required higher-level supervisory approval and more extensive documentation of why a judicial warrant wasn't being sought. Operations in sensitive areas required special authorizations and had to demonstrate significant emergency or public safety threat, not just the presence of someone with questionable status. Agents received more extensive training on constitutional rights and the limits of their authority. Compliance with these reform policies varied widely depending on local leadership and political climate, but at least now there was framework and accountability that didn't exist before. Carleen's personal life had also found a new chapter. She had met someone, an immigration attorney who had worked on a different case funded by her legal fund. They had connected over shared experiences and commitment to the same values, and after 2 years of dating, they married in a small, intimate ceremony. Most of the guests were her former students, now young adults who were thrilled to celebrate the happiness of the woman they had once protected, and who had protected so many others since. She sometimes still had nightmares about that morning, waking with racing heart from dreams where the agents somehow succeeded in taking her, where she was separated from her students and community that had become her family. Therapy had helped, as had time and the resolution of her legal status. But the emotional scars of living under constant threat, of knowing that agents with badges and guns had invaded her workplace specifically to rip her from her life, never completely disappeared. She used those scars as motivation, a reminder of why the work she did through her legal fund mattered so much. The policy changes that came from her case weren't perfect and didn't solve the larger systemic problems with how America handles immigration. People still lived in fear, families were still separated, and the line between legitimate enforcement and abuse of authority was still crossed. Too often, but Carline's case had proven that challenging that abuse was possible, that communities could protect their members, that the judicial system sometimes really would uphold rights even when the person invoking those rights didn't have perfect legal status. It was an imperfect but important lesson, one that gave hope to people who often felt they had none. The 2 agents who had entered the school that October morning disappeared from public view after losing their jobs. One reportedly moved to another state and found work in private security. The other faced multiple personal problems, including divorce and financial troubles that some attributed to the stress of becoming the face of federal authority abuse. Neither of them ever apologized publicly. Neither ever admitted their actions were wrong. For them, apparently, they had just been doing their jobs and been unfairly punished by changing policies and excessive sensitivities. That lack of understanding or remorse was a though sobering reminder that cultural change was as important as legal change. The media eventually moved on to other stories, as media always does, but the case's legacy remained. Occasional follow-up articles checked in with Carline, reported on the ongoing work of her legal fund, or used the incident's anniversary to explore broader issues of immigration policies and enforcement. Each such piece brought a new wave of supportive messages, donations to the legal fund, and stories from people who had been inspired by Carline's case to stand up for themselves or others in their own communities. 10 years after the incident, the school organized an anniversary event recognizing what had happened and celebrating the changes that had resulted. Carline spoke to a packed audience of current students, alumni, community members, and representatives from civil rights organizations. She spoke about fear and courage, about how courage didn't mean not being afraid but acting even when you were terrified. She spoke about the power of community, about how the people who stood with her that day had made possible all the good that came after. And she spoke about the ongoing responsibility to fight for justice, to never accept that some people deserve less protection or dignity than others. Thomas also spoke at that event, his words focusing on the students who had protected their teacher's door. He said they had taught the adults around them a lesson about integrity and moral courage that he would never forget. Several of those former students, now adults, were in the audience, some with their own children, passing forward the lessons they had learned on that frightening day when they put their bodies between their teacher and people who wanted to take her away. Carline Augustine's story became part of the fabric of how America thinks about immigration, rights, and the role ordinary communities play in defending constitutional principles. It wasn't the only story, didn't solve all the problems, but it was a story that mattered. It showed that resistance was possible, that rights could be defended even by the vulnerable, and that sometimes, just sometimes, justice really did prevail. For the thousands of people whose lives were touched by the case, directly or indirectly, this story became a reminder that change was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. And for Carline, who still taught math to ninth graders, who still loved the feeling when a child finally grasped a difficult concept, who still believed in education as a pathway to building a better life, the most important legacy wasn't the legal precedent or the media attention, or even the fun that had helped so many people. It was the lesson she had taught her students without needing to use words, that everyone deserves dignity, that rights belong to everyone, and that standing up for those things is worth whatever cost comes with it.